Stephen and Helen ready to host their 25th anniversary party. The garden was meticulously prepared, with flowers and full bloom and fairy lights strung across the trees, casting a magical glow as dusk approached. Stephen stood back, admiring their handiwork. "Can you believe it's been 25 years?" he asked. His voice filled with affection as he looked at Helen. Helen, arranging a bouquet of roses on the table, turned to him with a radiant smile. "I know. It feels like just yesterday we were young and clueless," she replied, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Tonight is going to be perfect." They had spent months planning this celebration, wanting it to be a grand affair, a testament to their enduring love. Friends and family were invited, and everyone was looking forward to an evening of joy and reminiscence. Stephen moved to the kitchen, checking on the hors d'oeuvres. The aroma of freshly baked pastries filled the air. "Everything's almost ready. Did you check the drinks?" he called out. Helen walked in, giving him a playful nudge. "Of course," all said. "Mr. Perfectionist." They shared a laugh, the kind that only couples with decades of shared history can understand. "This is going to be a night to remember," Stephen said, pulling Helen close for a quick kiss. Guests began to arrive as the sun dipped below the horizon, stiving a warm golden glow over the picturesque suburban neighborhood. The air was filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses as friends and family mingled. Sharing stories and congratulations, Stephen moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, his smile genuine but tinged with a hint of nervous excitement. Stephen, congratulations on 25 wonderful years, called out Linda, an old friend from college, as she embraced him. "Thanks, Linda. It's great to see you," Stephen replied, giving her a warm hug. Meanwhile, Helen flitted around like a butterfly, her laughter ringing out as she ensured everyone was comfortable and entertained. She moved from group to group, her presence a beacon of joy and hospitality. "Helen, you outdid yourself with the decorations," said Sarah, a neighbor, admiring the elegant floral arrangements. "Thank you, Sarah. I wanted everything to be perfect for tonight," Helen responded, her smile radiant. As Stephen continued to mingle, he caught sight of Helen talking animatedly with her boss. Richard. Richard was a tall, charismatic man with an easy charm that drew people in. He was successful, always impeccably dressed, and seemed to exude confidence. While Stephen had never doubted Helen's loyalty, something about Richard always put him on edge. Stephen walked over to join the conversation. "Richard, glad you could make it," he said, extending his hand. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Stephen." "Congratulations on the big milestone," Richard replied, shaking Stephen's hand firmly. "Thank you." "It's been quite a journey," Stephen said, his eyes flickering to Helen, who seemed unusually animated in Richard's presence. As the night went on, the party reached its peak. The garden was now bathed in the soft glow of fairy lights, and the sound of a live band playing their favorite songs filled the air. Guests danced, chatted, and enjoyed the festivities, creating a vibrant and joyful atmosphere. "Stephen, come on, let's dance," Helen called, pulling him onto the dance floor. The band was playing their song, a slow, romantic tune that brought back memories of their wedding day. Stephen and Helen swayed to the music, lost in each other's eyes. For a moment, everything was perfect. The world around them faded, and it was just the two of them, celebrating a love that had endured for 25 years. "You look beautiful tonight, Helen," Stephen whispered, his voice full of love. "Thank you, Stephen. This is exactly how I imagined it," Helen replied, her smile genuine. They danced until the song ended, and the guests applauded, cheering for the happy couple. Stephen felt a surge of emotion, grateful for the life they had built together, yet a nagging feeling of unease lingered in the back of his mind, when he couldn't quite shake. As the evening continued, Stephen found himself observing Helen more closely. He noticed the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed with Richard, the subtle touches and lingering glances that seemed to pass between them. Helen began to creep into his thoughts, a storm brewing beneath the surface. "Stephen, are you all right?" asked Tom, his close friend, noticing his distraction. "Yeah, just a bit overwhelmed, I guess," Stephen replied, forcing a smile. "Well, you and Helen deserve all the happiness in the world." "You've built something truly special," Tom said, clinking his glass against Stephen's. "Thanks, Tom. That means a lot," Stephen said, appreciating the sentiment. As the night drew on, the guests began to take their leave, each one congratulating Stephen and Helen on their remarkable milestone. Stephen felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as the crowd thinned out. The evening had been a success, but the unease in his heart had grown stronger. "Helen, you were wonderful tonight," Stephen said as they stood in the now quiet garden, the last of the guests having departed. "Thank you, Stephen. I'm so happy everyone enjoyed themselves," Helen replied, her eyes tired but content. Stephen looked at her, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. He loved her deeply, but the doubts that had surfaced tonight left him feeling uncertain. As they walked back into the house, hand in hand, Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that their seemingly perfect life was on the brink of a storm, one that could shatter everything they had built together. Just as the band took a break, Helen leaned in and whispered to Stephen, "Babe, I'm going to the washroom." She smiled and walked away, but instead of heading to the bathroom, she made her way upstairs to their master bedroom. Few minutes passed. Stephen felt a strange unease settle in his stomach. Something about Helen's demeanor seemed off. The sparkle in her eyes earlier had a strange edge to it, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Something to follow her, he quietly ascended the stairs, each step amplifying his anxiety. As he approached their bedroom, he heard muffled voices. His heart pounded as he slowly pushed the door open. What he saw made his blood run cold. Helen was on her knees, her boss Richard standing before her, pants down, she sucking the thing passionately. The shock and betrayal hit Stephen like a tidal wave, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. "Helen," he gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What the F are you doing?" Helen looked up, her expression won't have eerie calm. "Honey, you are not supposed to see this," she said, her voice devoid of shame or remorse. Stephen's world seemed to tilt on its axis. This was the woman he had loved and trusted for a quarter of a century, now betraying him in the most unimaginable way. His vision blurred with a mix of rage and heartbreak. Richard smirked. A look of arrogance plastered on his face. "You know, promotions come with a small price," he sneered, pulling his pants up nonchalantly. The casual cruelty in Richard's words snapped something inside Stephen. Rage coursed through Stephen's veins, and without a second thought he lunged forward. He grabbed Richard by the collar, dragging him away from Helen. The two men struggled, furniture crashing around them. Lamps toppled, picture frames shattered, and the pristine room quickly turned into a chaotic battlefield. Stephen didn't give Richard a chance to respond. His fist connected with Richard's jaw, sending him sprawling across the bed. Richard scrambled to his feet, but Stephen was on him in an instant, landing blow after blow. Blood spattered the sheets, mingling with the sweat and tears. "Stop it! Stop!" Helen screamed, trying to pull Stephen off him, but he was beyond reason. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too raw. He had given her everything, and this was how she repaid him. "You think you can disrespect me in my own home? You think you can take my wife and get away with it?" he roared, his voice trembling with fury. Richard struggled, trying to break free from Stephen's grip. "Get off me, you idiot!" he spat. But Stephen's rage had made him unstoppable. "You bastard!" Stephen shouted, his fists connecting with Richard's face. The force of the blow sent Richard stumbling back, crashing into the dresser. "You think you can walk into my life and destroy it?" Helen screamed, trying to pull Stephen away, but he was relentless. Years of pent-up frustration and unspoken fears fueled his every punch. Stephen fought back, but Stephen's rage gave him an edge. Each blow landing with a sickening thud, but Stephen was unstoppable, fueled by a fury that had been building up for years. Richard fought back, his hands pushing against Stephen's chest, but Stephen's rage gave him an edge. Every punch landed with the force of his heartbreak, his anger, his betrayal. "Stephen, you're going to kill him!" Helen cried, her hands clawing at his shoulders. Stephen paused for a moment, breathing heavily. He looked at Helen, tears streaming down her face, and something inside him snapped. He shoved Richard away, letting him collapse onto the floor, bloodied and beaten. Richard coughed, his hand clutching his side. "You're insane," he wheezed, his voice barely audible. You're crazy!" Stephen stood over Richard, breathing heavily. The room was in disarray, broken furniture, scattered clothing, and bloodstains on the floor and bed. Helen was huddled in a corner, sobbing uncontrollably, her face a mix of fear and guilt. Richard lay sprawled on the floor, his face bloodied and his clothes in disarray. The sounds of the party downstairs continued, oblivious to the chaos unfolding above. "You messed with the wrong guy," Stephen spat, his voice cold and menacing. His fists were still clenched, the adrenaline from the confrontation making him tremble slightly. "You both did," Richard, struggling to get to his feet, looked at Stephen with a mix of fear and defiance. "You think this is over? You don't know who you're dealing with," he sneered, though his voice was strained. Stephen took a menacing step closer, his eyes fixed on Richard. "I don't care who you are. You crossed a line that should never be crossed. And now you're going to pay the price. Get out of my house," he growled, "before I finish what I started." Richard, trembling, struggled to his feet. He staggered toward the door, casting a final, fearful glance at Stephen. "This isn't over," he muttered, blood dripping from his mouth. Stephen turned to Helen, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and hurt. "Why, Helen? Why would you do this to us?" His voice cracked with the weight of his pain. Helen sank to her knees, sobbing. "Stephen, I don't know. It just happened. I never meant to hurt you." Stephen shook his head, his fury dissipating into a cold, hollow emptiness. "You betch destroyed everything we built together. For what? For him?" He gestured to the doorway where Richard had disappeared. Helen looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "I was weak. It was a mistake, a horrible mistake." Stephen felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Love, anger, despair. He had loved her for so long, and now he didn't know if he could ever forgive her. "You made your choice, Helen. You threw away 25 years for this? Now you both will pay the price." She crawled towards him, reaching out to touch his hand. "Stephen, please. We can fix this. We can." He pulled away, his heart hardening. "No, Helen, some things can't be fixed. Some betrayals cut too deep." He turned his back on her, walking out of the room, each step heavy with the weight of his decision. As he descended the stairs, he could hear the distant sounds of the party still going on outside. It was surreal, the contrast between the celebration below and the devastation above. He stepped into the garden, the fairy lights casting a soft glow, and the laughter and chatter of the guests filling the air. He turned on his heel and walked out of the room, his steps echoing through the empty hallway. As he descended the stairs, the sounds of laughter and music from the party seemed distant, almost surreal. The vibrant energy of the celebration felt like a world apart from the devastation he had just witnessed. Stephen reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The guests were still mingling, unaware of the turmoil that had just erupted upstairs. He could see Linda chatting animatedly with Sarah, and Tom was engaged in a lively conversation with a group of friends. The normalcy of the scene was a stark contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. Stephen forced a smile and rejoined the party, his demeanor calmed but his mind racing. He accepted congratulations and compliments with a polite nod. All the while, his thoughts were consumed by the betrayal and anger he had just witnessed. He felt a cold determination settle within him. He would never let anyone disrespect him or his home again. Tom approached him, clapping him on the back. "Stephen, you all right? You look a little shaken." Stephen managed a tight smile. "Just a bit overwhelmed, Tom. It's been a long night. For sure, if you need to talk or anything." Tom's concern was genuine, but Stephen wasn't ready to share the details of what had happened. "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. I'm fine," Stephen said, his voice firm. He turned to scan the crowd, focusing on maintaining his composure. He needed to keep up appearances, at least for now. As the evening wore on and the party continued, Stephen found himself drifting through conversations, his thoughts miles away from the joyful celebration around him. The betrayal had left a deep scar, and the sense of violation was overwhelming. He felt a profound sense of isolation. Surrounded by people who were unaware of the reality behind the facade of celebration, Helen and Richard were left to confront the mess they had created. Stephen knew he couldn't face them again tonight, not while his emotions were still raw and volatile. The damage was done, and he needed time to process it all. When the last of the guests had finally left and the house was quiet, Stephen stood alone in the garden, the fairy lights now dimmed. He stared out into the darkness, feeling the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. Also, Helen packed her things and had to leave the house. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, betrayal, anger, and the aching void left by Helen's actions. He had loved her deeply, and now that love had been replaced by a bitter, hollow feeling. As he walked back inside, the house felt empty and cold. The celebrations had ended, but the real battle was just beginning. Stephen knew he had to confront the aftermath of this night to rebuild his life and find a way to move forward. But for now, all he could do was navigate the storm that had been unleashed one step at a time. In the days that followed, Stephen's mind raced with thoughts of revenge. The pain of betrayal festered, a raw wound that demanded retribution. He couldn't let Helen and Richard escape the consequences of their actions. The devastation they had caused was immense, and Stephen was determined to make them suffer for it. Stephen threw himself into researching Richard, delving into every facet of his life. He tapped into connections from his past, reaching out to old colleagues and acquaintances who might have insight into Richard's professional and personal life. What he uncovered was startling. Richard had a history of shady dealings and dubious connections, a tangled web of secrets that could potentially ruin him. One evening, Stephen sat in his study, a room now dedicated to his meticulous plans. He spread out a collection of documents, photographs, and notes on his desk. The room was dimly lit. He only sounded the occasional rustle of paper as he reviewed his findings. Richard's illicit activities were laid out before him. Fraudulent transactions, hidden assets, and unsavory associations. Stephen knew these were the keys to dismantling Richard's carefully constructed facade. He started drafting a plan, methodically arranging the pieces of his revenge. Stephen was thorough, ensuring that every detail was perfect. He formulated a strategy to expose Richard's wrongdoings, targeting both his professional reputation and personal life. He would leak the information to the media, make anonymous tips to regulatory authorities, and subtly ensure that the details reached the right people. Stephen took a moment to reflect on the situation. His heart was a battleground of conflicting emotions. The love he once had for Helen had turned to ashes, replaced by a burning desire for retribution. He had always been a man of principle, but the betrayal had driven him to a place he never thought he would reach. Helen, meanwhile, had been trying to reach out to Stephen. Her attempts to seek forgiveness met with cold silence. She called, sent messages, and even wrote letters, but Stephen remained distant and unresponsive. He couldn't look at her without feeling a deep sense of betrayal. The love they once shared now felt tainted, a cruel joke played by fate. And after noon, Helen showed up at Stephen's office unannounced. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She stood in the doorway, her voice trembling. "Stephen, please, we need to talk." Stephen looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "What is there left to say, Helen?" Tears streamed down her face as she stepped into the room. "I know I've hurt you deeply. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. Please just give me a chance to explain." Stephen shook his head, his anger barely contained. "Explain? There's nothing left to explain. You made your choice, Helen. Now you have to live with the consequences." Helen's shoulders slumped, and she choked back a sob. "I understand that you're angry, but I'm willing to do anything to make this right. Please, Stephen, don't shut me out." Stephen's resolve hardened. "It's too late for that. The trust is gone, and I can't just forget what you've done. I need time. I need space." Helen's pleas were met with his cold silence. As she turned to leave, Stephen felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by his desire for vengeance. He watched her walk away, her figure disappearing through the door, and then turned his attention back to his plan. With Helen and Richard's fate now in his hands, Stephen was consumed by his quest for revenge. He meticulously prepared every step, ensuring that when he struck, it would be with precision. He gathered evidence, organized his sources, and prepared to unleash the full force of his retribution. Stephen's nights were restless, filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. He knew that his actions would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Richard and Helen, but for himself as well. Yet the burning desire for justice drove him forward, a relentless force that would not be denied. As he finalized his plan, Stephen looked out the window of his office, the city lights twinkling below. The pain of betrayal still knotted him, but he was determined to see it through. The path he had chosen was a dangerous one, but Stephen was prepared to face whatever came next. His mind was set, and he would not rest until he had ensured that Helen and Richard paid for their actions. Weeks after the confrontation that shattered his life, Stephen put his meticulously crafted plan into action. He sat in his dimly lit study, the weight of his decisions pressing heavily on his shoulders. The room was filled with the soft hum of the computer and the rustling of papers as he prepared to execute the final phase of his revenge. With a final review of his carefully compiled evidence, Stephen clicked send on the email that would unleash the chaos. The secrets he had gathered about Richard's dubious dealings were now in the hands of multiple media outlets. The evidence was damning: fraudulent transactions, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and a network of corrupt associations. Stephen had ensured that the documents were irrefutable, leaving no room for Richard to maneuver. Over the next few days, the media frenzy exploded. Headlines screamed with Richard's name, and his once stellar reputation began to unravel in front of the public eye. The news reports detailed his shady financial dealings and unethical practices, painting a picture of corruption and deceit. Richard, who had once walked with an air of untouchable arrogance, found himself in the crosshairs of a scandal that threatened to destroy his life. Stephen watched the downfall with a cold satisfaction. He observed Richard's career crumbled. The board of directors at his company moved swiftly, and Richard was terminated from his high-profile position. The professional world turned its back on him, and his once impressive career was left in tatters. But the damage wasn't confined to Richard's career. His personal life also suffered severe repercussions. Friends who had once praised him now distanced themselves, and his social circles dwindled as the scandal spread. The man who had once commanded respect and admiration was now a shadow of his former self, his confidence replaced by humiliation and despair. The media spotlight didn't fade, it only intensified, exposing more about Richard's personal life. As his secrets came to light, his marriage suffered. His wife, who had been a supportive figure, found herself isolated, grappling with the fallout of her husband's actions. Their once stable life was now in ruins, mirroring the devastation Richard had brought upon himself. Helen, too, was reeling from the consequences of her actions. Stephen had filed for divorce with a firm resolve. The legal proceedings were swift and uncompromising. Stephen had ensured that the terms of the divorce left Helen with nothing from their shared assets. The house, investments, and financial resources that had once been a symbol of their life together were all safeguarded, leaving Helen empty-handed. As the divorce finalized, Helen faced the harsh reality of her situation. Once the center of a vibrant social network, she found herself ostracized. Friends and family who had once supported her now stood with Stephen, distancing themselves from her. The social support that had once been a pillar of her life vanished almost overnight. Invitations to gatherings ceased, and the phone calls and messages from those she had considered close friends stopped coming. Helen's attempts to seek reconciliation or support were met with coldness. Her pleas fell on deaf ears, as the people she had relied on for years now avoided her. She was left to grapple with the solitude and shame of her actions, the weight of her betrayal becoming increasingly unbearable. Stephen continued with a sense of grim satisfaction, knowing that the consequences of his actions were profound and far-reaching. While the media continued to cover Richard's downfall, Stephen focused on rebuilding his own life. The revenge he had sought had been achieved, but the personal cost was evident in the quiet, reflective moments he spent alone. With the storm of revenge finally quelled, Stephen found himself standing amid the ruins of his former life, ready to rebuild. The immediate aftermath of the upheaval had been a whirlwind of emotional and practical adjustments, but now, in the quieter moments, Stephen began to focus on crafting a new beginning. He threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. The projects that had once been overshadowed by personal turmoil now took center stage. Stephen threw himself into long hours and challenging tasks, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of his professional life. His dedication paid off, and he earned accolades and recognition for his efforts. Work became both a sanctuary and a source of fulfillment, offering him a sense of purpose and achievement. Stephen also reconnected with old friends and made new connections. The relationships that had weathered the storm of his personal chaos were rekindled, and he began to rebuild his social circle. He accepted invitations, attended gatherings, and re-engaged with the people who had supported him through his darkest times. The warmth of genuine companionship provided a stark contrast to the isolation he had felt during the turmoil. In his personal time, Stephen found solace in hobbies and activities that had once brought him joy. He took up painting again, something he had loved but neglected for years. The canvas became a refuge, a place where he could channel his thoughts and emotions into creative expression. Gardening also became a source of peace, as he tended to his plants and watched them flourish, symbolizing his own process of healing and growth. Yet, despite the progress in his external life, Stephen found himself grappling with the internal aftermath of the betrayal. The quest for revenge had consumed him, and the emotional scars it left behind were profound. The sense of closure he had sought through vengeance came with a heavy cost. The process of retribution had overshadowed the more personal journey of healing. Realizing that the pain and anger were still very much a part of him, Stephen decided it was time to seek professional help. He reached out to a therapist, someone he had been hesitant to approach, but now saw as a crucial part of his path to healing. In the initial sessions, Stephen confronted the emotional wreckage left by the betrayal. He spoke of the hurt, the anger, and the emptiness that had followed the collapse of his marriage and the downfall of Richard. Through therapy, Stephen began to understand that while revenge had provided a sense of justice, it had not healed the wounds within him. He learned that forgiveness was not about absolving Helen and Richard of their actions, but about freeing himself from the grip of bitterness and anger. It was a difficult and ongoing process, but Stephen approached it with a determined resolve. He worked on forgiving himself for the choices he had made, for the anger that had driven him, and for the ways in which the quest for vengeance had altered his own sense of self. The therapy sessions provided him with tools to manage his emotions and rebuild a healthier mindset. Stephen also began to embrace mindfulness and meditation. These practices offered him a way to quiet his mind and find a sense of inner peace. He learned to appreciate the present moment and to let go of the past that had once seemed to control him. The journey was not about erasing the past, but about finding a way to coexist with it and move forward with the renewed sense of purpose. As time went on, Stephen found that the pain of the betrayal softened, and he began to experience a sense of calm and acceptance. The process of rebuilding had taught him resilience and the importance of self-care. While the scars of the past remained, they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of his strength and his capacity to grow beyond the pain.